everyone, this is Dr. Loyola here, and this is our first online lecture video about distant reading and an introduction to Voyant. So this is actually going to be two videos. This first one is just going to cover a distant reading review, and then you will see an introduction to Voyant, which is the tool that you'll be using for your own distant reading. You'll see a video about that posted a bit later today. So what this particular video will cover then. First, we're going to review distant reading as it fits within the structure of this class, DCD 200 Intro to Digital Humanities. We're also going to review distant reading as a practice kind of in the wider world within wider disciplinary issues. So addressing things like why do distant reading, how distant reading relates to regular reading or close reading. And then we're going to look at the LOTR project, which is that distant reading project of Lord of the Rings, which we looked at a bit in class before spring break. So again, this video is primarily a review just to make sure we're all back in the same space thinking about distant reading and how it works within this wider ecosystem of digital humanities and reading practices. Okay, so we'll start then with our distant reading review with how it fits into this course. So you'll recall that our class is set up around three primary models of digital humanities work. Model 1 is taking humanities approaches and applying that to digital objects, which is something that you've all been doing in our first unit, where you made your interactive essays on different social media platforms. And it's also what you're doing with your presentations of different digital humanities books that you're all kind of sharing that presentation time for. Our second model, which is the unit we're currently in, is the reverse of this, which takes a digital approach and applies that to a humanities object. Our first version of this, of course, you did with markup and the recipes work, and now we're doing that with distant reading. And then finally, our third unit, which is where we're headed after distant reading, is the combination of these two different things of the humanities and the digital to create new objects or new approaches for study. So now, before we jump right into distant reading and thinking about digital approaches to humanities objects within that space, I want to talk a little bit about how we kind of can see some of this happening in response to the COVID-19 crisis. And this is both to kind of give you a sense of where this fits in with the real world, but also because it's like really happening right now. So we can see this happening in response to COVID-19 primarily with some of the ways that people are using the digital space and digital techniques to help communicate to people why we are social distancing and how to stay safe in this particular moment. So for instance, this hand washing meme that I hope you've seen around, if not, you should check it out, takes the lyrics of different songs and gets, 20 seconds of it and maps it onto this CDC model for hand washing to keep everybody safe and kind of give you something different from happy birthday or ABCs or whatever multiple times. And you'll notice that this particular image, which maps Truth Hurts by Lizzo onto this particular meme, this one comes from the washyourlyrics.com generator, which actually uses computational generation to produce this meme and to pull 20 seconds of the song and map it onto this visual. Right? In your next image, you see a graph of the effects of not flattening the curve versus flattening the curve. So why we're social distancing and why we're doing what we're doing. But in this case, it's been transformed with cats to make it a little bit more accessible. And of course, because the internet loves cats, right? So in each of these kinds of things, what we're really seeing here is this use of digital methods of networks, generation, information spread, right, across social media and across social platforms to clarify that humanities problem of communicating complex, specialized information to non-specialized audiences. Right? And in this case, that complex specialized information is, of course, hand washing technique and the graphing of the problem of social distancing and epidemic outbreaks, so why we're doing what we're doing. And then you'll also notice that while we're on the topic of flattening the curve and how we're seeing the internet respond to and share information about the epidemic is a lot of what we talked about in our first unit of class, which is this idea of using predictive data modeling to imagine future scenarios, right? So we talked about this with regards to baseball, with regards to predictive policing, Right, we talked about this quite a bit, but here's one which comes from the Washington Post, which actually maps out using historical data of what we know about human movements, what we know about how this disease spreads, what we know about other countries and communities and how this has worked and so on, to map out future scenarios of what might happen if we distance well. Right, so this comes from the Washington Post. You can see the link down at the bottom of your screen, and I do hope that you'll visit it if you haven't yet, that simulates different ways that doing nothing, trying to have a state-enforced quarantine, moderate distancing, or like really just kind of isolating and quarantining ourselves, the different effects that this might have on the spread of the disease. So for these particular graphs, brown is sick people, purple is recovered people, and that greenish gray is everyone else, basically. So here again is this kind of space that I just wanted to draw your attention to, where a lot of what we've been talking about in this class already is really happening in real time. And hopefully you've seen some of these things circulating on your own social networks in response to this epidemic. Okay, so returning to distant reading though, which is of course where we're headed and what you're actually going to be doing. In this class, this is, as I mentioned, our second practice for this digital methods applied to humanities objects. The first version of this, you'll recall, was our digital archives and markup that allows for rich cultural preservations. And for this, of course, you all made your markup for the recipes, imagining that we were kind of creating our own class cookbook, which was our class cultural heritage. And then we used markup to teach the computer to understand that content in more semantic and meaningful ways like humans do, rather than just as strings of textual data. And then for distant reading, you'll hopefully recall from before spring break, this is essentially about using the computer's superior skills of pattern recognition and data and information processing at scale, so big data. It's using the computer's superior skills than humans, right, so that we can read massive amounts of text that humans simply can't read. Right? And I do want to be clear that in this class, we'll be focusing on literary texts, but this, of course, could be done with any kinds of text. And one other area where this happens a lot, and we'll talk about a little bit shortly here, is in historical papers, right? So reading historical documents and historical texts. So just to get right down into it, let's just take a second to define distant reading and catch back up to speed on this particular front. So first, distant reading is the empirical analysis of literary or humanities texts, right? It's taking a kind of scientific, observable approach to what's happening in the text so that we can approach it in a more like immediate, as I said, scientific, empirical way. Often this also means that there's a quantitative analysis of text as well. So we're counting and we're looking for numbers of patterns and numerical representations of humanities text, often for looking at things like patterns of frequency or comparative differences, often by counting the words and the patterns of words as they appear in a text. And then often, though not always, we are working at a scale beyond human scope. For this class, we are going to scale this significantly down, and we will be working on a single text, right, which of course is within the scope of humans. But generally speaking, when we do distant reading beyond a classroom space, this is done at a large scale. And so what does that mean? What is a scale beyond human scope? So this can be an issue of how much content you're dealing with, right? So thousands upon thousands of books, right? We talked a little bit about if we wanted to read every book ever published in the 20th century, right? That would be, I mean, probably in the millions at this point of texts. And that's far beyond any kind of human scope to do, but very easy for a computer to do. Another way that we can think about the problem of scale is granularity of content, right? So when we read, we tend to focus just on words, right? But of course, words are supported by things like commas, periods, semicolons, and so on. And you might be sitting here thinking like, okay, but that's not really all that important. But what we might want to do is some kind of analysis of an author's use of semicolons versus commas versus periods to get a sense of, I don't know, their style, right? Or perhaps I use semicolons a lot, whereas you all use commas a lot, and that might help us identify, oh, this was a text written by Dr. Loyola, this was a text written by one of her students, simply because of that difference of semicolon versus comma use, right? So it can help us identify authorial voice and who's written something. And then finally, another way is because that content literally doesn't exist, right? So it is beyond human scope because it doesn't exist for humans. And to give you one quick example of that kind of work, we can look to Lauren Klein, who's a digital humanities scholar at Emory. We can look to her work on James Hemings. So James Hemings, just to catch you all up, was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, and he worked as Jefferson's chef. So there's lots of correspondence about James Hemings and about his kind of the kinds of meals that he would create that gives us information about cultures of early American food and relationships between Thomas Jefferson and his enslaved populations and so on. But what we don't ever have, for instance, is content from Hemings himself. So what Lauren Klein has done is she's basically read and mapped patterns of correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and all these other people who visited his home and ate food by James Hemings, right? And so mapping that, trying to find a gap and understand more of the role that James Hemings played in this household, because otherwise that content simply isn't available. So in this case, we could look at this as a historical use of distant reading to try and recuperate James Hemings as something more than just Thomas Jefferson's enslaved cook, right? And instead we can see, and what she has shown through this kind of work is that he actually played an incredibly important role in the household and was kind of like a significant figure for American food culture as that has descended into today. Okay, and then finally, while we're defining distant reading, another space that we just want to be clear about is that often distant reading includes visualizations of data to illustrate what is actually going on, right? Because as we've seen in the COVID-19 information, we as humans understand some kind of graphical representation of data much better than like a huge table of numbers or huge tables of percentages and so on. Okay, so why do distant reading? What's even the point of this, right? We all can read, and what are the odds that any of us are going to be working on something where we require millions upon millions of texts, right? Well, I mean, that's a fair question, but this is why it exists kind of in the world. So one, as we saw with Lauren Klein's work, it can recover or improve historical record and our understanding of historical cultures that otherwise we wouldn't be able to know about. More broadly, though, within the space of literary study, is that literary study has what we can think of as a problem with data collection and sample size when we do research into literary or cultural history, right? So when we do a scientific sample, for instance, you need some kind of significant percentage of content in order to demonstrate that whatever kind of trend you're looking at or whatever kind of conclusions you're drawing actually matter, right, for culture broadly speaking or for every kind of person. And really the same thing should be required for literary study, right? That when we talk about what people were writing about in the 20th century, what people were thinking about in the 19th century, whatever, we ideally want to have a significant sample size. And yet that very rarely is the case. So for a quick example demonstrating this, I'd like you all to take a second and think of a movie genre that you know really well, maybe romantic comedies or superhero movies, right? Just think about that genre and take a second, pause the video if you want, to just jot down or think about specific things that you expect from one of these movies, right? So what are some things that if you're sitting down to watch a rom-com, you know is going to be there or you know is going to be present in a superhero movie, whether that's character types or plot events or what have you. Okay, so just take a couple seconds and think about that. Okay, so once you've done that, I'm going to walk us through this process with a rom-com. So if we think about a rom-com, right, there's certain things that we know are going to happen in every single romantic comedy, right? There's going to be some woman and she's going to be with a man and she thinks that's the man she wants, but really there's going to be some other guy, like some best friend or some random guy who appears in the early scenes that is really the guy that she needs to end up with, but for some reason she hates him or thinks they're just buds or, whatever. But he, of course, loves her or has loved her for a long time. And by the end of the movie, things will happen and they're going to ultimately end up together. And she's going to realize that that first guy is just total trash, right? And we know that that's going to happen because that's basically the formula of a romantic comedy, right? Superhero movies, I don't know these quite as well, but you might have sketched things like, we know there's going to be like an origin story of how this person became a superhero. There's probably going to be some kind of tragic past, right? Like lost parents or other family members. There's probably going to be some kind of arch nemesis or really clear bad guy, right? Who they're going to have to fight off to save the world. And we also know that at the end of a superhero movie, the superhero is going to win, right? The bad guy is definitely not going to win. So again, these are the patterns that we can see in these genres. And that's, I think, probably pretty accurate, right? Like the patterns that you've described and that you're thinking about are probably pretty true. But let's think about how this actually works for data collection and how this points to the problem of sample size. So now let me ask you, when you imagine expectations for either of these genres, how many rom-coms or superhero movies have you actually seen? Like really? The MCU's what, 30 movies? So take that number, and then what percentage do you think this makes up of all the rom-coms or all the superhero movies or TV shows or books or content, right? Superhero stories that exist out in the world? It's probably a pretty low percentage, even having seen the entire MCU, right? It's probably less than 10%, I would bet. And rom-coms is probably even less. So here's my question for you. Is this probably less than 10% number, is this a significant enough percentage for you to say definitively, right, quantitatively, empirically, and scientifically that this is exactly how rom-coms and superhero movies play out every time? Probably not, right? Like that probably would not hold up in a scientific journal if we were doing some kind of empirically demonstrated scientific proof of superhero movies or rom-coms, right? And this is the problem of data collection and the problem of scale that the humanities broadly have, especially when thinking about literary trends and literary cultures. This is Charlotte Fay. She's going to help us close out this particular part of the lecture. So now that we've thought about this problem of data collection, right, what distant reading helps us do is it helps us address this problem within literary study and textual study by widening that sample size to include a more significant percentage of texts, right? So we can be much more confident in imagining our rom-com or our superhero patterns if we know that we've seen 50% of those texts, or 75% or 80%, right? Even 90 to 100%, right? We probably can't ever truly get 100 because, of course, these are still being made, but you get the idea, right? That when we have a wider sample size and a more significant percentage, we can be more confident in our conclusion that the pattern that we're identifying really is the pattern that we're seeing, right? And really is representative of that content. Okay, so our final piece of this distant reading puzzle that we want to kind of be clear about is how distant reading relates to close reading, or the kind of reading that you typically do in an English class, or that we expect to do. Yep, that's purple. That's right. I know, more purple. We are learning colors and distant reading. Okay, so in close reading, and we did this in class again before spring break, typically, right, you take a small sample of text, right? So a single poem, as in this case, a single line from a poem, a single chapter or single paragraph or whatever, right? And you read it so deeply that you move beyond the words on the page and also look for things like rhyme, rhythm, metaphor, alliteration, right? You might ask, like, why use this word and not another? Like, why use woods instead of forest in this particular instance, right? Or why is the evening snowy? Why isn't it a snowy morning, right? What do all these particular choices mean for this particular text? So we did that with this particular poem for Robert Frost before spring break. So we're not going to do it again right now. But this is just, hopefully you recall that kind of work that we might have looked at the rhythm, we might point out repetition, right? So what I'm trying to highlight here is that, again, we're still looking at patterns in the text, right? We're looking at patterns of imagery, patterns of repetition, patterns of tone, patterns of frequency. and so on, right? So it's really the same practice as distant reading, but at a smaller scale, right? And with different tools. Okay, so at its core, what I want to be clear about is that distant reading is about pattern recognition at scale beyond human, and it's ultimately exploratory, right? It's about making hypotheses about texts and then testing them based on the kind of data analysis that you can have. So often we wouldn't just distant read, right? You might do some distant reading along with some close reading, or distant reading and then going back to the text to check that what you think you're seeing in the graph is actually represented in the text, or to say, hey, there's something funky in this graph. I wonder what it is in the text, right? And so that's effectively what this is, right? So I want you to embrace this spirit of exploration and hypotheses as you write your own distant reading reports, which is, of course, what we're heading to, right? So don't stress too much, I guess, about getting it right or getting it wrong, right? This is just about looking at the data, practicing reading it, and getting some practice at making statements about that data. So in order to do this effectively, there are a few things that you do need to pay attention to, right? So first, you need to know what data you've actually collected, right? This seems really obvious, but as we'll walk through in the next video when we're getting into Voyant, this actually takes a little bit more care than what you might immediately think, even when just working with a literary text. The second thing you need to know is specifically what is being graphed from the data, right? So often it can look in these graphs like a computer is reading the text for us, or like it's showing us something. But we need to be clear that we're the ones bringing that interpretation, right? The computer can only show us patterns, it can show us numbers, it can show us correlations, right? It can show us all kinds of stuff, but it's up to us to actually make the interpretation of what the computer is showing us, right? And we do that by having a clear understanding of what the graph is showing us with that data and what's actually being graphed. And then finally, because we're working with text, we also need to understand how text works in English, right? And this is everything from things like that when we see a capital letter, right? That tells us that this is a proper name, maybe a person, maybe a place, or it could be the beginning of a sentence, right? It's also knowing that things like the word light might be an emotional word, right? Like, oh, I feel lighthearted today. Or it could simply be a description of the setting, right? Like it was a light and sunny day, right? Or the light was very clear that day, or whatever the case may be, right? So it's about knowing all these different things of how text and language works in English and keeping all of that in mind as we go through.